It's almost bedtime. But before I go to bed, I wanted to make a short video. And it was this little post that I put up on Facebook on the Bealtaine Cottage Goddess Garden site that made me remember a very special woman. There are many, many special women in my family. All of the women were special. But this particular woman happens to be my great-grandmother. And I'll just show you what I've written here. On this midwinter night in the west of Ireland, remembering all the women in my family as we near the solstice and rebirth. A strong woman loves, forgives, lets go, tries again and perseveres, no matter what life throws at her. So, I want to share the story of my great-grandmother O'Neill, with you. And just come over here to the stove and sit down. There's a Sammy bear just in the low light, and there's a remarkably bright, white, beautiful boy who's been washed. So the story of my great-grandmother O'Neill. Well, I only actually got to know the story when my father came to visit here on one of his many visits. But it was something about what was happening in my life at that time that jarred his memory. And at that point in time, my daughter had become quite ill, and I had the full care and welfare of my two grandsons, who were just wee cubs, as we'd say up in Oma. They were just wee cubs at that time. But I had them for about a year, and it was very difficult. And so on this occasion, Mum and Dad were sat at the kitchen table, and Dad proceeded to say something like, "History seems to repeat itself." So I queried this, and he proceeded then to tell me about my great-grandmother and the remarkably strong woman that she was. I look back on this conversation with my father, and I think to myself, with just a little bit of a glow in my heart, that at that point in time he seen me as a strong woman. So I take that as a huge compliment, because my father never said much on these issues. But the story he told me was a remarkable story about a truly remarkable woman. Now, this would have been his grandmother. And my family lived in Oma, and quite impoverished. A noble family, but quite impoverished. No land, and no property. And in fact, the story goes in my family that we were of the O'Neill family that was left behind after the flight of the Earls in the 16th century. So we were dispossessed, so to speak, but always regarded ourselves as quite a noble family, and despite the poverty, there was always a great store put by education and knowledge, and a little bit of a taste for the finer things in life too. But anyway, I'm deviating now, as is my way. So, the story goes that great-grandma's daughter eloped with the young man from Oma. Now, that was a huge disgrace, because of course we're talking about a Catholic family in what was predominantly a Catholic town, and in those days, in fact up until fairly recently, the Catholic Church ruled with quite an iron fist. You really had to obey or you were an outcast. It was very, very strict, very difficult for women. But, so there was shame brought on the family by my great-grandmother's daughter eloping, and little was heard from her until, well, I say little was heard from her. Stories came through that herself and the man in question never married, and there was a child born from the union, which of course was extremely shameful in those days. It was, I mean, women were so, they were so blamed for everything. Anyway, some years elapsed, I think it was maybe a year or two, and word came through to Oma that my great, what would she have been, my great-great-aunt, was in the workhouse in Glasgow. So they had gone to Scotland, and they had become kind of subsumed into the city of Glasgow. As most runaways would do, they would go to a city and, you know, sort of disappear. But word came through that she was in the workhouse in Glasgow. So this is now the ultimate shame. So this young woman was in the workhouse in Glasgow with her child, and she was birthing a second child. And things weren't going well. She was very ill. So if you can imagine the incredible shame which was now on the family, and the general way of dealing with this was to distance oneself from the shame. You certainly didn't immerse yourself in it by going to the help or rescue of the young people involved. You just distanced yourself. And in fact, so my father told me, the parish priest called to the house and instructions were given in no uncertain terms that this sinner, she was suffering her fate in the workhouse in Glasgow, and no one was to have anything to do with the situation, and that the nuns would take care of the child and the baby if it survived. Things weren't looking too well at this point. My great-grandmother, this remarkable woman, decided that she was going to make the long journey to Glasgow. Now, in those days, it was an epic journey. It was an epic journey, and you certainly would have had to go and borrow money to make the journey. Off she set, against the will and instruction of the parish priests. Off she set for Glasgow to the workhouse. By the time she got there, her daughter had died in labour, and there was a wee boy and a baby girl. She brought them both back to Omagh. That was something you did not do in those days. But she brought both the children back to Omagh. And she was made an outcast for some time, because you can imagine to have an illegitimate child in your house was one thing. To have two illegitimate children in your house was quite another. And to have brought them back from a daughter who had lived in sin, so to speak. This was how it was all regarded. So as my father said, she was a mighty, mighty woman. And the little boy, he was called Eddie, and anyway, the wee boy died at the age of 9 from diphtheria. This is before vaccinations and whatever. The wee girl was called Kate, and she grew up to be a remarkably strong and resilient young woman, and married well. She married well, and she didn't have any children herself, but she married well and lived a long, happy life. And my great-grandmother, of course, the great-grandmothers on both sides were remarkable women. But great-grandma O'Neill, she continued to go to the church and hold her head up high. I mean, it must have been insufferable, because everybody would have been talking about you and pointing the finger, so to speak. But the reason why I'm remembering my great-grandma O'Neill tonight is that it's always been traditional within my family to, especially the solstice, Samhain and the winter solstice. Now the summer solstice is quite different, but Samhain and the winter solstice are both times to remember the ancestors, to remember the people who have gone before. And for me especially, because I do align myself with all aspects of the goddess, and therefore women, and I feel that women need to have champions, but more importantly, their story needs to be told, because all of history is about battles, war, kings, a few queens, but it's mostly about one very narrow side of life. And we are inclined, in fact we are almost encouraged, well, we are encouraged to forget and not to even talk about the mythology, the stories, the histories, or the herstories of women. And she was just an incredible woman. And what she did was incredibly courageous, and not to mention financially very difficult. Those were the days before there was any help from the state. There were no pensions, there were no welfare payments. So it would have been very difficult to have brought 2 small children into her household and then reared them. So, just remembering my great-grandma O'Neill, and just paying tribute and sort of bringing that energy into my own life. Because I think that this is a very important thing for us to do, be we women or be we men, to sort of draw down that female energy. It's an amazing energy. It's a nurturing and all-encompassing energy. And it's an energy which is there. And we hardly have to ask to tap into it. And I think, just to kind of finish off this story, my father, when I was a young girl growing up, my father was a bit of a misogynist, as most of the men of that time were. And but you know, and of course he was married incredibly young, so his ability to mature within himself was very limited. But as he grew older, he became very aware of where the root of this incredible earth energy lie. Or should I say lay? This earth energy lay. And that began to manifest itself in how how he regarded life. And of course I've told you the story about the drunken hen. He was very, he became very, in a subconscious way, able to embrace his divine feminine side. So, as we approach midwinter and the solstice, it's a lovely thing to do, just to light a candle. I've lit a candle this evening, and in particular in memory of my great Grandma O'Neill, a mighty woman. A mighty woman.